The Nevada desert did not welcome anyone in July. It simply endured, and if you were foolish enough to stand inside it, you endured alongside it, or you did not endure at all. By 10 in the morning the temperature had already crossed 108 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of heat that had weight to it, that pressed down on your shoulders and fogged the inside of your skull. The sand was not the pale, romantic sand of postcards. It was pale gray gold and sharp, and it got into everything: your collar, your rifle's action, the corners of your eyes, and it did not apologize. Firebase Dalton occupied a dried lake bed in the western Nevada basin, 40 miles from the nearest paved highway, a sprawl of prefabricated structures behind 2 rings of concertina wire. The base had been repurposed 3 years ago as a long-range marksmanship training facility for special operations candidates, and it wore that purpose with Spartan authority. The ranges ran north to south, aligned with the prevailing wind corridors. The longest was Range 7, which stretched a measured 2,200 meters from the firing line to the steel plate bank at its far end, a moderate range by the standards of the men currently using it, though they would not have described it as moderate. They would have described it as their personal monument. 6 of them were positioned at the line when the woman appeared at the gate. Staff Sergeant Derek Calloway saw her first, which was unusual, because Calloway prided himself on seeing everything last that did not involve his own excellence. He had the eyes and the ego of a man who believed his perception was curated, that he chose what to notice. But movement at the gate caught him, the way anything at the edge of stillness catches the shooter's eye, and he tracked her with the automatic focus his training had installed in him, and then he registered what he was looking at, and the focus became amusement. She was perhaps 60, perhaps older. The desert aged things, though this woman did not look aged in the softened sense. She looked weathered, the way a good piece of leather looks weathered, compact, dried to its essential self, useful. She wore faded khaki trousers, a long-sleeved shirt the color of old sand, and a wide-brimmed hat that threw the upper half of her face into shade. She carried nothing visible except a small canvas bag over one shoulder and a rifle case, a long, narrow, scuffed black case that she held at her side with the casual ease of someone who had been carrying one her entire life. The gate guard spoke to her. She produced a document. The guard studied it, looked at her, looked at the document again, and then made a phone call that lasted less than 30 seconds. Then he opened the gate. Calloway watched her walk through. She moved without hurry. No performance of confidence, the way young operators sometimes performed it. The squared shoulders, the deliberate stride. She simply moved like someone who had already decided where she was going and saw no reason to communicate that decision to anyone watching. She crossed the open ground between the gate and the far edge of the firing range, and she stopped there, at the boundary rope, and she looked out at Range 7. She stood very still. She was reading the desert the way you read a difficult text, not scanning, not sampling, reading. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, Calloway's spotter, noticed the direction of Calloway's attention and shifted his scope. He observed the woman for a moment, then he set the scope down. "Who's the civilian?" he said. "No idea," Calloway said. "She's at the range boundary. Someone should run her off." "Yeah," Calloway said, and did not move, because he was watching something. The woman had tilted her head slightly. She was looking at a small drift of sand at the base of the nearest berm, watching the way the surface shifted in the thermals that rolled off the ground in invisible waves. Then she turned her head slowly, not sharply, and she looked at a strip of surveyor's tape tied to a pole at the 500-meter mark, watched it lift and settle and lift again. She was reading the wind. Calloway decided he did not find this interesting and looked back at his rifle. 20 minutes later, when their range safety officer approached her and asked politely if she needed assistance finding her way back to the main building, she produced the same document again. The RSO read it, and his posture changed in a way that was subtle and which none of the 6 shooters on the line were positioned to read clearly, and he told her she was welcome to observe from the boundary rope if she stayed clear of the active firing positions. She thanked him. She stayed at the boundary rope. She watched them miss. The miss that mattered was Calloway's, and it was not a miss in any embarrassing sense. The round struck 9 inches low, and 3 left at 1,800 meters in a 22-knot crosswind, with significant thermal drift, which was a result most men on most ranges in the world would have accepted as a functional hit. But Calloway knew it was low and left before the spotter called it, because he had felt the trigger brake wrong, and because he had seen the Mirage columns dancing at the mid-range mark, and had made a calculation that he now understood had been off by a margin. He did not want to examine too closely. He was cycling the bolt when he heard the voice. "The Mirage is running right to left at the 800 mark, the woman said. She was at the rope, maybe 8 feet behind and to his right, and she spoke in a conversational tone, not loudly, but clearly the way you speak when you are certain of what you are saying and do not feel the need to project. But it reverses between 1,200 and 1,500. The column at the mid-range pole is leaning downwind. Your correction was for a consistent left-to-right push. But you had a reversal in the transit zone. That's why it went low left. Calloway turned his head. She was looking at the range, not at him. Her hat was still pulled low. Thanks, he said, in the tone men use when they mean the opposite. The temperature gradient is also pulling rounds down through the 1,600 to 1,900 stretch, she added. The ground heat creates a negative pressure column. You can see it in how the Mirage columns lean at the base. They're bowing out, not rising straight. You'd need to add about a quarter mil of elevation for that zone specifically. I appreciate the commentary, Calloway said. Webb had turned around. He was grinning, the way young men grin when they anticipate entertainment. Hey, ma'am, you shoot? She looked at Webb for a moment. Her eyes, in the shadow of the brim, were a pale, flat gray. A little, she said. This was, apparently, extremely funny. Webb's grin widened. Behind him, Private First Class Tyler Rhodes, 23 years old, 8 months out of the schoolhouse, and possessed of the unearned certainty that comes from being very talented at one thing before the world has had the opportunity to demonstrate how many other things exist, actually laughed. A short, bright sound. A little, Rhodey said. That's great. What's your best distance, ma'am? 200 meters? 300? She said nothing. I pushed 1,200 meters last month, Rhodes said. First round hit. Good conditions. He paused, and the pause was theatrical, the pause of a man who understands he is performing. That's over 3/4 of a mile. I'm aware of the conversion, she said. Rhodes, said the RSO, whose name was Chief Warrant Officer Frank Delacroix, from where he stood with his clipboard at the far end of the line. His tone carried sufficient weight that Rhodes stopped talking, but Delacroix did not intervene further, and the 6 men on the line took this as permission to feel whatever they were feeling, which was collectively a mild, comfortable contempt of the kind that requires no cruelty to maintain. The woman turned back to the range. She was watching the surveyor's tape again. Her lips moved very slightly, not in speech, but in the way a person's lips move when they are running calculations, private arithmetic, internal, unhurried. Calloway loaded a fresh round and settled behind his scope. He made the correction she had described, the quarter-mil elevation, the account for the reversal zone, without consciously deciding to. His hands made the adjustments while his mind was occupied with not acknowledging that his hands were making them. The round hit center plate at 1,800 meters. He said nothing. She said nothing. Behind him, very quietly, she unzipped the canvas bag and removed a small notebook and a mechanical pencil, and she began to write something down. Her name, as far as anyone at Firebase Dalton knew it, was Margaret. She had signed in at the gate as Margaret Holloway, and the document she carried was a retired federal employee credential that the gate guard had recognized and the RSO had not needed to call about for very long, which suggested it carried some weight from an organization that did not print its name on things unnecessarily. She did not offer more than that. She did not explain her presence. She had been here before, or somewhere like this, and she carried the stillness of a person who understood that the desert did not require explanation, only attention. By the 3rd hour, Calloway had stopped pretending not to watch her. She was not watching the shooters. She was watching the range specifically. She was watching 3 reference points simultaneously. The tape at the 500-meter pole, a second tape at the 1,400-meter mark that was barely visible to the naked eye, and something at the far berm that Calloway could only see through optics. She had not touched the rifle case. She had written several pages in the notebook. She had drunk water from a canteen exactly twice, at intervals that suggested a scheduled discipline rather than a response to thirst. At 1,100 hours, Corporal James Tate attempted a 2,000-meter shot that was already at the outer limit of his demonstrated capability in these conditions, and the round went long right by a margin that the spotter called at 40 inches. Wind shifted at the 1,700 mark, the woman said. Not to Tate, not to anyone in particular, to the air. She's right, said Delacroix. From behind the spotting scope he had quietly begun using. He sounded as though he was doing arithmetic he hadn't intended to show. The flag at the 1,600 mark rotated about 18 degrees. She called it about 12 seconds before the shot. Calloway looked at her. She had not looked up from her notebook. How did you know it was going to shift? Webb asked. He was no longer grinning. He was asking an actual question, and there was a difference in his voice that he did not try to conceal. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the Mirage columns at the 1,400 mark were compressing laterally. When columns compress, it means a pressure differential is closing. The wind behind the differential is faster. It arrives in 6 to 15 seconds depending on the terrain between you and it. She paused. This terrain is flat. It was 8 seconds. Webb stared at her. Where did you learn that? He said. I spent a long time watching the wind, she said. What range? Several, she said, and wrote something in the notebook. Rhodes, who had been quiet since Delacroix had stilled him, now moved down the line to where Calloway was lying behind his rifle, and he leaned down and said quietly, she's probably just some retired analyst, probably read a lot of books. You know the type. Calloway looked through his scope at the 2,200-meter plate at the far end of range 7. Yeah, he said, probably. He was not sure he believed this, but the alternative required a recalibration that was uncomfortable. and so he set it aside. The radio call came at 1347 hours, and Delacroix took it in the command trailer with the door closed, and when he came out his face carried the particular blankness of a man who has received information that has not yet assembled itself into a plan. He called the 6 shooters off the line. The situation, as he described it, was this. A reconnaissance element, operating in a large restricted area 20 kilometers to the north, had identified a stationary target of significant interest. The target was located in a dry canyon. Observation assets had confirmed the target had not moved in 4 hours, and the assessment was that it would not move for at least 2 more. The military necessity which Delacroix outlined with the careful brevity of a man who knew his audience did not need details was a single long-range precision shot, not a strike package, a single round. The distance from the proposed firing position to the target was 3,840 meters, measured. Confirmed by 2 independent assets. The conditions: ambient temperature 112 degrees Fahrenheit. Ground temperature in excess of 140 degrees at the canyon floor. Wind variable, quartering, between 12 and 28 knots. Significant mirage distortion throughout the transit zone. A 2-degree cant to the terrain that would require correction. Humidity effectively 0, which would affect ballistic coefficient in ways that the standard tables did not fully account for at this distance. The target was stationary behind partial cover. The window was 3 hours, possibly less. Delacroix stopped speaking and looked at his 6 shooters. The silence that followed was the silence of men who were very good at what they did, confronting the honest interior arithmetic of what they were very good at, and arriving at a number that fell short. Calloway spoke first. "That's past our certified range by 1,600 meters, Chief. I'm aware. At these temperatures, with this mirage load, the accuracy envelope at that range, I'm aware of the accuracy envelope, Sergeant. Who do we have within reach who's worked at that distance?" Webb said. Delacroix said nothing, and then, because he was a good officer, and understood that silence communicated things that words could not always afford to, he turned and looked toward the boundary rope, where Margaret Holloway had been standing for the past 4 hours with her notebook and her canteen and her scuffed black rifle case. She was watching the canyon direction when Delacroix approached. Not looking at anything specific, there was no canyon visible from the range, but oriented toward it the way a compass needle orients, as though she had already known where north was and had been standing with it at her back this whole time. He explained the situation. She listened. She asked 2 questions. The first was about the exact orientation of the canyon floor relative to the prevailing wind corridor, and she asked it with the specificity of someone who already knew the answer and was testing whether the information she was receiving was accurate. The second question was about the surface material at the canyon walls, whether it was sandstone or basalt, because basalt retained heat differently and would create different thermal column behavior in the afternoon hours. Delacroix answered both questions and then waited. She looked at the horizon for a moment. "I'll take the shot," she said. Delacroix nodded once. Behind him, Calloway had been close enough to hear, and now he made a sound, not quite a laugh, but the soft exhale that precedes one. "Chief, she's 60 years old. We don't know what she's done. We don't know what she shot." "Staff Sergeant," Delacroix said. "I'm just saying, 3,800 meters in these conditions is not a range where we bring in a—" "Staff Sergeant Calloway," Delacroix said, and his tone had changed in the way that tones change when the conversation is over. "Go get her rifle case." Calloway's jaw tightened. He looked at the woman. She was looking at the horizon again, paying him no more attention than she had been paying the canyon, which was to say, she was tracking it, in the background, with the relaxed diligence of someone who catalogs everything and dismisses nothing. Rhodes stepped forward. His voice was controlled, but only barely the control of a young man who has confused the performance of seriousness with seriousness itself. "Ma'am, with respect, if you miss, the window closes. We don't get another shot." "I know," she said. 1,200 meters is not 3,800 meters. There's no comparison in the physics. The wind drift alone at that range. In this heat, would you like to tell me about the physics of it?" she said, quietly. "Or would you like to move?" A pause. Rhodes looked at Delacroix. Delacroix said nothing. Rhodes moved. The woman reached down and picked up her rifle case without ceremony, the way you pick up a bag you have been setting down and picking up for decades, and have long since stopped noticing the weight of. "I'll need your longest bolt action," she said to Delacroix. "What do you have on the rack?" "Accuracy International AXMC in 338 Lapua. We also have a Shaytak M200 in 408. Shaytak," she said immediately. "And your best matched ammunition, not the standard training load. Whatever you have that was load tested at this temperature range." Delacroix made a phone call. Calloway watched her walk toward the transport vehicle, her case in hand, her hat still pulled low, her pace unhurried as sand in a glass. He said nothing. Webb, standing at his shoulder, said nothing either. But Webb's expression had changed into something that had no contempt left in it. The firing position was a natural depression in the northern rim of the basin, 8 kilometers from Firebase Dalton, and 2 kilometers from the canyon's eastern approach. It offered approximately 16 inches of cover at the prone position, which was adequate and no more. The ground was compressed basalt under a skin of sand, and it had been absorbing heat since sunrise, and when she lay down on it she felt it through the mat she had deployed without hurry, a methodical spread of equipment, each piece placed with the attention of someone who had done this so many times that the ritual had become physiological, as automatic as breathing, and as necessary. The Chetak was heavier than she would have chosen if she had been choosing, but it was what they had, and it was a good rifle. And she had worked with worse. She mounted her optic her own, from the case, a Schmidt & Bender 5-25 power that had more hours behind it than the man who'd made the delivery remarks would accumulate in a decade, and she settled behind it and began to look. The canyon was 3,840 meters by GPS. She had been given a laser range reading of 3,822 meters from the observation post, and there was a 12-meter discrepancy that she noted and resolved in her favor of the laser GPS. Atmospheric corrections in this temperature range were less reliable than a good laser return. She would use 3,822 meters. She took no notes. Everything was happening in the space behind her eyes, in the architecture of calculation that 40 years of fieldwork had built into her nervous system until it was indistinguishable from instinct, but was not instinct, was the opposite of instinct, which is discipline maintained past the point where ordinary people stop maintaining it. Wind. She watched the canyon approach for 11 minutes without touching the rifle. She was watching the sparse desert scrub at the 800-meter mark, and the 1,400-meter mark, and the disturbed sand patterns at the 2,100-meter transition where the terrain dropped 4 meters before rising again toward the canyon rim. The wind at the firing position was a consistent 16 knots from the northwest. At the 800-meter mark it was closer to 12. She could see the scrub flex. At the 1,400 it was shifting, cycling between 8 and 19 knots in a pattern that had a period of roughly 40 seconds. She counted 3 full cycles, then 2 more. The period was 43 seconds, not 40. Temperature. She had a Kestrel weather meter, but she barely looked at it. The ground heat was creating a negative refraction layer in the first 30 meters of air above the surface. She could see it, the characteristic shimmer, and this would push rounds down through the transit zone if not corrected. She had seen this before. She had seen it in conditions worse than this, in places where the ambient temperature had been higher and the terrain had been more complex and the consequences of missing had been different in quality than they were today, though the mathematics had been the same. Mathematics does not care about consequences. Coriolis. At this distance and latitude, 38 degrees north, and with a flight time she calculated at approximately 5.3 seconds for the 408 Chetak cartridge, the Coriolis effect would deflect the round approximately 1.2 inches to the right. Negligible at 1,000 meters. Not negligible at 3,822. She dialed her corrections without speaking. 37 minutes of preparation. Delacroix had assigned Webb as her spotter, and Webb had been professional enough to stay quiet throughout, offering data when she asked for it and withholding it when she did not. She had asked for range confirmation, wind speed at the observation post, and the exact orientation of the target's partial cover. She had not asked for anything else. Calloway was 50 meters behind the firing position. He had not been invited and had not been told to leave. She noticed him the way she noticed everything registered, catalogued, filed. There was a memory, somewhere in the preparation, that she did not invite but which came anyway. The way certain things come when you are lying still in the silence before something important. A different desert. A different rifle. A distance that had been, at the time, considered impossible by everyone except the man whose name she had borrowed for the calculation, her first instructor, a laconic Arizonan named Harold Foss, who had taught her that the wind was a text, and that patience was not a virtue but a skill, and that there was no such thing as a shot that could not be solved, only a shooter who had not yet solved it. She had been 22 years old. She had taken the shot. She had hit. Harold Foss had said nothing afterward. He had simply made a note in the logbook. The logbook had passed to her when he retired. She had not opened it in 8 years. At 1,621 hours, with the sun beginning its long desert descent and the temperature in the canyon still holding at 109 degrees Fahrenheit, Margaret Holloway made final adjustments to her scope. She took a breath, exhaled half, stopped. Her left hand was forward of the bipod, fingers loose against the stock, no grip, just contact. Her right hand was behind the trigger, the first joint of her index finger resting against the shoe of the trigger blade in the way she had rested it 10,000 times, 100,000 times. A contact so rehearsed it had lost its identity as a gesture and become simply the position of her finger, as natural and as inevitable as the position of her eyes and her skull. Webb had the spotting scope up. Nobody spoke. The wind at the position was 16 knots. At the mid-range, in the cycle she had measured, it was currently at the 11-knot phase. She could see the scrub angle, could see the shimmer pattern at the 1,400-meter mark. Lean and relax and lean again. She needed the shot to break in the 12 to 14-knot window at mid-range. which came at a specific point in the 43-second cycle. She watched, she counted. Her heart rate, which she had spent 4 decades learning to govern, was 61 beats per minute. She did not need to check this. She felt it in the same way she felt the trigger as information, neutral and precise. 17 seconds. The scrub at the 800 meter mark flexed slightly. The shimmer at the 1,400 mark shifted its lean by 2 degrees. The sand drift at the base of the 2,100 meter terrain break changed direction for 3 seconds, then resumed. 29 seconds. The cycle was tightening. She had a brief, irrelevant, involuntary thought. Harold Foss, in the Arizona heat, saying the wind doesn't fight you, you just have to wait for the moment it agrees with you. 38 seconds. The scrub at the 800 meter mark went still. The shimmer at 1,400 straightened. The sand at 2,100 paused. She broke the trigger. The Chaytak 408 has a muzzle velocity of approximately 3,000 feet per second, and it is one of the few commercial rounds designed specifically for extreme long-range engagement. Its construction optimized for ballistic stability through the transonic transition zone that kills lesser projectiles at extreme range. At 3,822 meters, in standard conditions, flight time would be approximately 5.1 seconds. In these conditions, the negative refraction layer, the variable wind transit, the Coriolis push, she had calculated 5.3 seconds. The shot broke at 1,623 hours and 41 seconds. The recoil was a solid push, not sharp, not violent, a push, and she was back on the scope before the muzzle had fully settled, watching the transit. She could not see the round. Nobody can see a round, but you can see what the round moves through. You can see the shimmer at 1,400 meters disturbed by a passage. You can, if you have been watching this particular shot corridor for 40 minutes, notice the infinitesimal disruption of air at the 2,100 meter break. She saw it. She did not exhale. 5.3 seconds is a long time when you are waiting for something to either happen or not happen, and it is no time at all when it is over. The radio on Webb's belt crackled. The observation post at the canyon rim said 2 words, in the flat, compressed syllables, of a man doing a professional job and not embroidering it. Target down. Webb pulled the spotting scope from his eye. He looked at it, as though the piece of glass and metal had performed the action, and he was trying to understand how. Then he looked at the woman lying in the depression with the Chaytak still at her shoulder, her cheek still at the stock, her eyes still forward. She had not moved. She cycled the bolt. The spent case came out, brass and hot, and fell into the sand. She watched the canyon approach for 4 more seconds, a final sweep, habit and profession, and then she lifted her cheek from the stock and sat up, unhurried. Behind them, the silence had spread. Calloway was standing 50 meters back, and he was not moving. His hands were at his sides. His face held an expression that was not quite anything recognizable. It was the face of a man from whom something has been quietly removed, and who is in the process of discovering what that something was. Rhodes was 6 meters closer. He had been watching through a small monocular, and the monocular was now at his side, and his face was entirely blank. Delacroix had the radio at his ear. He was listening to the observation post relay a detailed confirmation of the hit angle, placement, effects, and his expression was the careful, disciplined neutral of a man who was receiving extraordinary information and refusing to perform his response to it. He lowered the radio. He looked at the woman. She was gathering her mat with the same unhurried economy with which she had deployed it. Confirmed hit, Delacroix said. First round. She nodded once, as though this was a logistical confirmation and not the end of a sentence that had begun with everyone in this vicinity believing she could not finish it. Webb said something. He said, "Ma'am," and stopped. And then he said it again, "Ma'am," because apparently it was the only word he had available and he felt some pressure to use words. She looked at him. That was he stopped again. "It was a shot," she said, not dismissively, not performing modesty, simply as a matter of taxonomy. A thing had been classified, and the classification was accurate, and there was no need to reclassify it using a larger word. She zipped the mat into its sleeve. Calloway walked toward the depression. He walked slowly, not because he was reluctant, but because his legs had apparently decided on deliberateness. He stopped at the edge of the firing position, and he looked at where she had been lying, and then he looked at her. "The quarter-mil elevation," he said. She looked at him. "This morning," he said. "At the range. The quarter-mil correction for the thermal column. I used it. It hit center plate." She waited. He paused. "I didn't say anything." "I know," she said. "That wasn't." He seemed to be searching for a word. "That wasn't how I should have responded." She picked up the Chaytak in its case, having field stripped it with the same quiet efficiency with which she did everything, and she looked at Calloway for a moment with those pale flat gray eyes, and she said, "No, it wasn't." And then, "But you made the correction." She walked past him. Rhodes was in her path, and he did not move aside, and for a moment, it seemed like something was going to happen, a conversation, a reckoning, a performance of some kind. But when she reached him, she simply looked at him, and he stepped aside, and she walked through the space he had made. Delacroix had his laptop in the command trailer when he made the search, and he made it privately. In the 10 minutes after the team had loaded the vehicles and begun the return drive, he typed her name into the system, her full name, which he had from the credential she had provided at the gate, and he waited. The file that returned was not extensive. It was the opposite of extensive. It was the kind of file whose brevity is itself a communication stripped, sanitized, the institutional equivalent of a face with its expression removed, which tells you something was there before someone took the trouble to remove it. What remained? Margaret Ann Holloway. Retired Federal Service. Multiple citations. Date of retirement redacted. Assignments redacted. One operational notation, not redacted, which read, Long-Range Direct Action Operations, Various Theaters, 1980, 9/2019, 30 years. The world record notation also not redacted, because some records, once set, become too public to erase, which cited a confirmed engagement at 4,210 meters, set under conditions that the notation describes simply as adverse, which in the language of Federal Service documents was the equivalent of another person screaming. The record was 8 years old. It had not been broken. There was a designation. 2 words, the kind that get attached to a person after enough time and enough operations have given the administrative record some texture beyond the blank of redaction. The designation was Pale Echo, which had been her call sign in an environment that Delacroix did not have clearance to fully understand, and below it, in a notation he suspected had been added by someone who knew her and chose to leave it as a marker rather than a detail, was a second phrase, Ghost of the Dunes. He sat with this for a moment. Then he read the single operational summary that had not been redacted, a paragraph describing, in the compressed and technical language of official reports, a shot taken in a desert theater in 2011, at extreme range, under adverse conditions, against a high-value target, that had succeeded where 3 previous attempts by a full team had failed. The paragraph was dry and administrative, and contained the phrase first-round contact in the same matter-of-fact register, as one might note a weather reading. He thought about the morning, about the woman at the boundary rope, reading the wind with a notebook and a mechanical pencil, watching the surveyor's tape at the 500-meter mark for 4 hours, while men who had not reached her experience level laughed at the width of her hat. He closed the laptop. He picked up the radio. He said, to the driver of the lead vehicle, pull over. The convoy stopped at the edge of the basin, where the paved service road began and the desert opened up to the north in a flat, empty expanse that was not dramatic and not beautiful and was entirely itself pure, unembellished Nevada desert, holding its heat, indifferent to being observed. She was in the rear vehicle. He went to it and opened the door and leaned in. Miss Holloway, he said. She was looking out the opposite window. Pale Echo, he said. She turned her head. Her expression did not change. It was, he thought, the face of someone who had long ago made peace with being known and did not require that knowing to be spoken aloud to confirm that it had occurred. The record still stands, he said. Not a question. As of this morning, she said. Today's distance doesn't count, she said. No official observer. Wrong format. He nodded. Then, for what it's worth, I want to say, Chief Warrant Officer, she said, not unkindly, you don't need to say anything. He stopped. She looked at him with those gray eyes that had spent 40 years reading wind and distance and the algebra of trajectories, and she said, nobody here did anything I hadn't seen before, and nobody here needs to feel bad about it. He thought about this. Do your young people know what they saw today? He asked. They'll figure it out, she said. Or they won't. Either way, they'll remember the shot. He stepped back from the vehicle. The convoy resumed. At Firebase Dalton that evening, after the vehicles had returned and the rifles had been racked and the range officers had submitted their incident documentation, Rhodes sat in the common room with a cup of coffee he had not drunk and a question he had not asked. Calloway came in and sat across from him. They were quiet for a while, the way men are quiet after something has happened to the interior geography of their understanding. You know what gets me, Rhodes said finally. He had his hands around the cup. She didn't need to do it. Nobody made her. She could have just said no and gone home. She came here on her own, Calloway said. Right. Nobody called her. She just showed up. Yeah. Why does someone do that? Rhodes said. That's why does someone come back to a place like this after 30 years? Just to stand at a rope and watch? Calloway thought about this for a long time. I don't know, he said. Maybe she needed to remember something. Remember what? Calloway picked up his coffee and did not answer, because he did not have an answer, only a feeling, which was the feeling of a man who has been shown a distance and has understood, for the first time with something approaching real comprehension, how far away it is. She was gone before reveille. The gate log showed her departure at 0342 hours, which is a time of night that is more accurately a time of morning, when the desert cools to a temperature that most people would still call hot, and which she probably called comfortable. There was no note. She had returned the Chaitak to the arms room and left the borrowed ammunition accounted for in the logbook, each round signed out and each unused round signed back in with the accuracy of someone who had never in 40 years left a logbook incomplete. Webb found one thing she had left behind, the mechanical pencil, On the bench at the boundary rope, he picked it up and held it for a moment, and he thought about the things that had been written with it, the columns of numbers, the wind readings, the patient cartography of a range that she had mapped more completely in 4 hours than the 6 of them had mapped in 3 months of training. He put it in his breast pocket. The sun came up over the basin. The heat resumed its work. The desert, which had witnessed the morning and the afternoon and the shot that had crossed 3,822 meters of shimmering Nevada air and arrived with the precision of mathematics made physical, kept its silence the way it kept everything, without commentary, without sentiment, without the noise that lesser things make when they want to be noticed. At the far end of Range 7, the surveyor's tape at the 500-meter mark lifted in the morning thermals, rose 6 inches, and came back down. The wind had shifted 2 degrees. She would have noticed. 3 weeks later, Delacroix submitted a request through proper channels to have the engagement formally documented. The request was returned without action. There was a handwritten notation at the bottom, 3 words in a hand he did not recognize. She prefers it that way. Legends do not require documentation. They require only that something happened, that somewhere, in the heat and the silence and the long patient geometry of extreme distance, a finger settled against a trigger blade with the authority of 40 years and 10,000 mornings. And the wind agreed, and a round traveled 3,822 meters through the shimmering impossible air of a Nevada summer and arrived exactly where it was calculated to arrive. That is sufficient. The rest is echo.